interest rates are a reflection of risk. It's as simple as that. And also, at a very, very minor level in these fiat currency days, it's also the fact that you're using my money, or my facilities, my credit, whatever. I'm handing it over to you. No, I'm not going to do that for nothing. So, there is a sort of an element of that in it. But the main thing really nowadays is risk. And you've got two risks. The obvious one, if you lend credit to, say, a corporation or something like that, you've got the risk that they won't repay. Similarly, if you lend money to a bank in the form of a deposit, there is the risk that they may not repay. Now, in normal times, it's a very small risk. But nevertheless, you should expect a small premium over the value, if you like, to you of actually just parting with the credit, as opposed to the risk within the credit. But then today, there is another risk, and that is the currency risk. The currency risk is big because the issuers of these currencies are getting into huge debt. The credit bubble is something which periodically happens throughout history. And it's basically when credit, you just end up with too much credit in the system and it needs to be washed out. It's actually quite hard to recognize at the time because, you may be in good times and you think this is absolutely fine and everything's going all right. Okay, the economy isn't great, but, stocks are going up and so on. That's classic credit bubble, but very difficult to recognize when you're in it. It's far easier to recognize the debt side of credit. And I think we can all agree that we are in a debt bubble. And indeed, we're in the largest debt bubble. For every debt, there is a credit. And of course, it depends where that credit is targeted. And the credit is targeted very, very much at financial assets and particularly equities. So that's the background to it. Previous examples of these credit bubbles, we could go back into history for, so long as we've got sort of good financial records. You've got the Mississippi bubble in France, which was engineered by John Law, who basically was a proto-Keynesian. You had the South Sea bubble in London. You had the tulip bubble before these two. And that actually was based on a commodity, if you like. Not much of a commodity. I think someone actually ate an onion thinking it was an onion, and it turned out to be a very valuable tulip bulb. But anyway, so that's the sort of thing that goes on. When you get this credit being produced and it goes into financial assets, that is your classic credit bubble. The last really big one, of course, was 1929, following the Roaring Twenties. We've all heard the stories of the Roaring Twenties and how, bellhops were giving tips to people, and also shoe shine boys and so on were telling the next customer, the previous guy who's, Mr. So-and-so and so-and-so of such and such a bank is buying this and, passing tips, all that sort of environment.
History offers stark warnings. Centuries ago, the tulip mania, then later the South Sea bubble and the Mississippi bubble, all unraveled under the weight of speculative credit. In the 20th century, excessive leverage paired with mass euphoria culminated in the 1929 crash. And during the late 1990s, early 2000s, the dot-com boom proved how modern credit-driven bubbles can form around new technologies. Each time, exuberance, easy money, and overconfidence masked financial fragility until the music stopped. Those events show how quickly bubbles can go from normal to catastrophic.
We saw that actually with the dot-com bubble back in the year 2000. So those are examples, if you like, of bubbles. This credit bubble is, by any measure, the largest in history. Again, I say, if you doubt that, just look at the debt. The debt is the largest in history. All major governments are, G7 governments, with the exception of Germany, but they're going there, are like 100% debt to GDP or even more. In the US, it's 120% or something. UK, it's a bit over 100. France is about 110, 115. Germany is about sort of 65, but, they've just taken the brakes off debt limitations to spend money on defense, allegedly. But the economy is tanking. So this is the other problem with debt to GDP numbers. When the economy tanks, obviously, the number just shoots up because the divisor, is getting smaller. So that basically is where we are. Now, there are concerns, I think, about this position. We look very similar to 1929 in in two respects. First of all, this is a purely financial bubble concentrated on markets. And the second thing is that in 1930, we had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Today, we've got a far bigger bubble than we had in 1929. And we have, call it Smoot-Hawley Mark II. I mean, we don't know how Trump's tariffs are going to settle down, but there is widespread ignorance, even in the economic community, about the consequences of tariffs. But the evidence from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is absolutely clear. It just absolutely backfires every way you can imagine on the perpetrator of higher tariffs. I mean, we start off with, some tariffs, some trade restrictions and all the rest of it, and that is now increasing. So I would think that the way Trump's tariffs will settle out are probably going to be at least as bad as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, which it's estimated added another 20-odd%, if you like, on the value of imported products. And of course, it's not just imported products for consumers, it's also intermediate goods which are affected. And in many cases, commodities as well. And we're seeing exactly the same thing today. So those two things basically happened at the peak of 1929. We are very close to the peak of this one. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a very unhappy anniversary, a downturn, if you like, the market peaking within the next month or two. I think your next question should be, what's going to trigger it?
Today's crisis isn't just a national problem, it's global. Worldwide debt climbed to roughly 3 times global economic output over the past decade. In major economies, sovereign borrowings and margin debt have exploded, while much of that credit is targeted at financial assets, especially equities, not productive investment or infrastructure. Such allocation inflates markets, creates a fragile illusion of wealth, and magnifies risk. Rather than funding real-world enterprises, large portions of borrowed money are fueling speculation, making the financial system increasingly vulnerable to shocks.
That, quite clearly, is bond yields. I mean, there is this misconception that central banks actually have complete control over interest rates and bond yields. They can start with interest rates and then they can do yield curve manipulation, whatever. No. They can do that a lot of the time in ordinary times. But when you get an extreme time like this, they've got no control. Just look at the long bond yields in the US T-bills. Look at the long gilt. Look at the long JGB. I'm talking 30-year maturities here. And also, this will surprise you, look at Germany's 30-year bond. All these yields are either going into new high ground, which means that the markets are tanking, or look as if they're on the verge of going into new high ground. You find, I mean, I've been a broker for, 6 decades or something. And the one thing I have noticed, the relationship between bond yields and equity markets, is that the equity market will always stand the initial rise in bond yields. But when you get a second rise in bond yields, that valuation effect works through negatively to the equity markets, and you then get a bear market in equities. We've had the initial rise, which was actually quite nasty, like from zero effectively and negative in some cases, up to where we are now, yielding, looking at US treasuries, 4.2% on the 10-year. Looking at Germany, we're looking at about 3.6 or something on the 30-year bond. In the UK, we're looking at 4.7 on the 10-year. I mean, this was quite a sharp move up, basically. And so far, I mean, there was a bit of a wobble when this really sort of got kind of rich in the equity market. But then as yields backed off, consolidating, moving sideways broadly, the equity market has just roared. And so what's been pushing it? I mean, this business about a credit bubble, just look at the FINRA numbers for margin debt. That is now over $1 trillion. And bearing in mind that back in 2010, it was about 200 billion. It's now over $1 trillion. That is real leverage in the wrong place. This is what I mean about a credit bubble really hitting financial assets.
Take the United States. In 2025, its government debt reached roughly 119% of GDP. Projections suggest this won't improve. By 2035, debt to GDP might climb beyond 140%. Many other nations walk a similar tightrope. As governments accumulate more debt to service persistent deficits, interest costs consume larger slices of revenue. That reduces fiscal flexibility and heightens vulnerability to economic downturns, demographic shifts, or geopolitical stress, all while borrowing keeps rising.
Let me just say the smartest people in the economic world don't understand credit, which is why they get sucked in at the top, as Keynes did in 1929, as Fisher did in 1929. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Fisher who said something like, equities are never going to go down or something. Well, all these bubbles are fueled by credit. I mean, if you go back to the South Sea bubble, for example. Now, in those days, we think that everything was settled in gold or paper which represented gold, like in the form of a banknote which was actually backed by gold. But no, actually what was happening was that the goldsmiths were the sort of proto-banking system which we have today. And they were creating credit just the same as the way banks do today. They were lending it into existence. And of course, you got people turning up wanting to invest in the South Sea stocks and things like that. So, this guy's credit worthy. Yeah, okay, we'll create some credit for him. So that's what happened. You get the credit bubble. They're all credit bubbles. I think we should understand that credit is actually a good thing as long as it's not misapplied. There are three ways in which you can apply it. One is you can apply it to finance production. That is good, and it's not inflationary. Or you can apply it to finance consumption. That is inflationary, and it's not good. Or the third way you do it is you apply it to financial assets, and that just merely inflates the financial assets. It spreads a good feel-good factor, and the collateral which you've got against the loans goes up and up and up. So banks are happy with this, and they think this is absolutely wonderful, but they don't actually realize what they're doing is creating a bubble, which at some stage is going to burst, and then everything goes into reverse. So that's what I mean by the application of credit. I mean, there are those three ways in which it happens. And with a financial bubble, it's angled mainly at financial assets.
One often overlooked vulnerability: bond yields. Normally, central banks influence short-term rates, but when markets sense deep structural debt problems, long-term yields can rise on their own. That undermines valuations for equities and other financial assets that thrive under cheap credit. In such moments, leverage unwinds rapidly. As yields climb, previously inflated values begin to wobble, margin requirements tighten, and asset prices can cascade downward. The second leg of yield increases, not the first, historically tends to trigger sharp equity losses.
We didn't have anything like this level of margin debt. I mean, the difference then was that credit was being applied into residential property. It wasn't really being applied into financial assets as such. It was applied into the financing of residential property. And of course, we had not just, the inflation, if you like, of property prices, but we had bad practices, getting on the back of this, all this sort of leverage, with sort of artificial synthetic means of financing and all this sort of stuff. And it was that went wrong. And of course, the other thing is that derivatives as a whole had increased quite a lot on the back of this. And there was misunderstandings about what derivatives were. We had AID, insurance company, originator of many derivatives, because they looked at derivatives as an extension of the insurance business, which you could argue it is. But it's actually a completely different animal. When things went wrong, they went wrong big time. And so that was effectively a problem over property and derivatives. This time is different. Property is not really, property has increased in value along with, if you like, the falling purchasing power of the currencies. But it hasn't been all that spectacular, generally. Obviously there are areas where it has been spectacular. But today, really, this credit has been very much targeted at equities, and particularly the sort of equities which you saw in the dot-com bubble, high tech, new stuff, AI, and so on. Things we don't understand, but we're buying the damn things because they're going up. Anyone who's old-fashioned enough to think that value matters, go away, you're an idiot. They're all pursuing momentum. And what happens with momentum when it goes? Oh dear, we remember that. Do you remember the Nasdaq falling after the year 2000? I think it lost 3/4 of its value. This is where people have got to understand what an interest rate is. If this is interest rates are a reflection of risk. It's as simple as that. And also, at a very, very minor level in these fiat currency days, it's also the fact that you're using my money, or my facilities, my credit, whatever. I'm handing it over to you. No, I'm not going to do that for nothing. So, there is a sort of an element of that in it. But the main thing really nowadays is risk. And you've got two risks. The obvious one, if you lend credit to, say, a corporation or something like that, you've got the risk that they won't repay. Similarly, if you lend money to the bank in the form of a deposit, there is the risk that they may not repay. Now, in normal times, it's a very small risk. But nevertheless, you should expect a small premium over the value, if you like, to you of actually just parting with the credit as opposed to the risk within the credit. But then today there is another risk, and that is the currency risk. The currency risk is big because the issuers of these currencies are getting into huge debt.
If the bubble bursts, consequences could be far-reaching. Interest payments might overwhelm government revenues. Pension funds and institutions loaded with leveraged assets may suffer deep losses, and consumer confidence could collapse, sending the economy into recession. The pressure could force spending cuts, tax hikes, or even debt restructuring. The world might confront a wave of market corrections, sovereign stress, and reduced global growth. If policymakers fail to act preemptively through reforms and prudent debt management, today's prosperity might unravel, leaving lasting scars across economies worldwide.
And there's absolutely no sign that they're taking the foot off that accelerator. It's getting faster, and particularly with the dollar. So what we're seeing is the risk element, if you like, as far as buyers of bonds, in other words, lenders of credit to the US government are concerned. The risk element is getting higher and higher. Now, part of that is reflected in the fall in the purchasing power of the dollar, which we translate into inflation. We see prices rising. And if you're going to go and buy, say, a T-bill or something like that, which is going to be redeemed within the next 28 days or half year or whatever, then, that's actually not too much of a problem. You're not going to lose too much, if you like, if there's a sort of, if prices start rising, whatever. But if you're going to go and buy something which is, say, 10, 15, 20 years out, then, what's the return? How do you measure this risk? Well, the answer basically is that you've got to sort of think, what's going to happen to the purchasing power of the dollar over that sort of time? And you might put it into a computer if you've got a very clever program, but basically you think, this is risk. What's got to be my reward? And then you look at the possibility of a debt trap. Now, how does that arise? Well, the way in which interest is paid, not that it's ever paid, but it's accounted for, is out of taxation, okay? So you're looking at the private sector's ability to produce the revenue for the government to cover the interest on the debt. Now, the private sector in America and everywhere else is not growing. You look at GDP, it's growing, yeah, but take out the government deficit, then you've got a better idea of actually what's being produced by the private sector. The private sector, if you take that deficit out, is actually contracting and has been for the last 2 years, and will probably contract even more in the future. So the ability of the US government to service its long-term debt is being badly compromised. So what's my risk? What's my risk in this as a potential buyer? It's increasing. I can't quantify it. I don't want to buy this stuff. So what happens is that the bond have to fall in the market. In other words, the yield has to rise to a point where I may be tempted to do this. But the problem with the debt trap is the higher the yield goes, the worse the position is. So, if you're not going to buy it yielding, 5%, I think it's 4.9% or something on the 30-year, the long bond. If you're not going to buy it at that, you're not going to buy it at 6% or 10%. What's going to make you buy it? Well, there's got to be. Yields are going to have to rise to the point where the politicians actually notice and think, we've got to do something about this. We've got to cut our spending. Now, how far away are we from that? I think we're an awful long way away. So you can see that there is significant upside in the yields on the long end of the bond market.